Let's continue talking about purchasing power parity. So this gives us the relationship between relative inflation rates, the capital I, and the exchange rate E. Okay, remember in the last video, we talked about that interest rate adjustment is necessary for the relative purchasing power to be the same whether buying products locally or from another country. If the purchasing power is not equal, consumers will shift purchases to wherever products are cheaper until the purchasing power is equal. Okay, so our exchange rate will be adjusted if we have inflation rate differential from the two countries, meaning the price is different in the two countries. Okay, so the exchange rate of the foreign currency, EF, equals 1 plus IH, inflation rates, home inflation rate, IH, divided by 1 plus foreign inflation rate, IF, minus 1. The simplified PPP relationship is that the exchange rate, EF, for the foreign currency equals the difference between home inflation rate and foreign inflation rate, IH minus IF. Using PPP to estimate exchange rate effects, the relative form of PPP can be used to estimate how an exchange rate will change in response to differential inflation rates between two countries. International trade is the mechanism by which the inflation differential affects the exchange rate according to this theory. Okay, so when the inflation rate between the two countries changes, the exchange rate will change as well because of the international trade mechanism. Scenario 1, when there's a relatively high local inflation, okay, meaning the price is higher domestically, so we would buy more from foreign countries, right? So imports will increase while exports will decrease. Local currency should depreciate by same degree as inflation differential. Scenario 2, when we have relatively low local inflation, imports will decrease, exports will increase. Local currency should appreciate by same degree as inflation differential. Okay, we've discussed this before, right? When exports decrease, there are less exchange for US dollars. Okay, so the local currency, for example, US dollar, would depreciate because of the lower demand. When exports increase, the local currency, for example, US dollar, will appreciate because there are more people exchanging the foreign currency for US dollar, so the demand for US dollar is higher. Okay, and the value would appreciate when the demand is higher. Okay, that's how the inflation difference between two countries will affect the currency exchange rate. Scenario 3, when local and foreign inflation rates are similar, there is no impact of inflation on import or export volume. Local currency's value is not affected by inflation. Okay, but if there is a difference in inflation between the two countries, exports and imports will be different, so the foreign exchange rate will, or the local currency value would change. Okay, this is how the inflation rates differential affects exchange rates. Okay, this is the reason why we have this or the mechanism of the purchasing power parity, and the equation, simplified equation, is that the foreign exchange rate becomes home inflation rate minus foreign inflation rate. Graphic analysis. Using PPP theory, we should be able to assess the potential impact of inflation on exchange rates. The points on the exhibit 8.2 on the next slide suggests that given an inflation differential between the home and foreign country of X%, the foreign currency should adjust by X% due to that inflation differential. PP line, the diagonal line connecting all these points together. Okay, so because exchange rate of the foreign currency EF equals IH minus IF, the home inflation rate minus foreign inflation rate. So we have this purchasing power parity, which is the same line as Y equal X. Okay, any points on this line satisfy our equation that E equals to IH minus IF. Okay. Here we also say that delta percent change in the foreign currency's spot rate. The change in EF also equals to the change in IH minus IF. Okay. An inflation differential between the home and the foreign currency of X%, the foreign currency should adjust by X% due to that inflation differential. Okay, so if the difference between the two inflation rate is say 4%, 4.8, then there's also a 4% change in the foreign currency's spot rate. If the difference between the inflation rate between the two countries is -5, like point B, then the change in the foreign currency spot rate is also -5. Any points off the PPP line represent purchasing power disparity. If the exchange rate does not move as PPP theory suggests, there is a disparity in the purchasing power of the two countries. Okay, so anything on the line satisfies our PPP theory. Anything off the line is purchasing power disparity, not purchasing power parity anymore. Point C in Exhibit 8.3 represents a situation where home inflation rate, IH, exceeds foreign inflation rate, IF, by 4%, yet the foreign currency appreciated by only 1% in response to this inflation differential. Consequently, purchasing power disparity exists. Okay, so we're looking at this line. We have a point of point C, for example, where the difference between home inflation rate and foreign inflation rate is 4%. But the change in the foreign currency spot rate is only 1%, so we have disparity in purchasing power. Okay, and any point above the line actually gives us an increased purchasing power of foreign goods. Okay, when home inflation rate is much higher than the foreign inflation rate, but the foreign currency spot rate only increases by 1%, increases much less, then there's an increased purchasing power of foreign goods. Simple tests of PPP. Choose two countries such as the United States and a foreign country and compare the differential between their inflation rates to the percentage change in the foreign currency's value during several time periods. We can do this kind of simple test to test PPP theory. Okay, we can also do statistical tests to apply regression analysis to historical exchanges and inflation differential. Results of tests could be that deviations from PPP are not as pronounced for longer time periods, but they still exist. Thus, reliance on PPP to derive a forecast of the exchange rate is subject to significant error, even when applied to long-term forecasts. Okay, so we have simple test, statistical test, and they tell us that PPP has errors, especially for long-term. Okay, so if we compare US and a foreign country and compare the difference in their inflation rate to the percentage change in foreign currency's value, we can see here in this graph, exit 8.4, comparison of annual inflation differential and exchange rate movements for four major countries. We can see US inflation minus Canadian inflation in the first graph compared to the percentage change in Canadian dollar. Okay, we can see that it's not perfectly a line that we expected. It's not the upward sloping y equals x line. No, so for Swiss, Japan, Britain, Great Britain, all the similar regressed lines are not, all the faded lines are not the ones that we expected. Okay, there's an error in the test. Limitations. Results vary with the base period used. The base period chosen should reflect an equilibrium position since subsequent periods are evaluated in comparison to it. If a base period is used when the foreign currency was relatively weak for reasons other than high inflation, most subsequent periods could show higher appreciation of that currency. That would be then what would be predicted by PPP. Okay, so there are errors and limitations for the test of PPP theory. Why purchasing power parity does not occur? First reason, confounding effects. A change in country spot rate is driven by more than the inflation differential between the two countries. We've discussed this before, right? The percentage change in the spot rate, E, is a function of change in the inflation rate differential between the two countries. Also, the interest rate differential of the two countries, and income differential between the two countries, and also changing government control and change in expectations of future exchange rates. Okay, so it's not only affected by inflation difference. Reason number two, no substitutes for traded goods. If substitute goods are not available domestically, consumers may not stop buying imported goods. Okay, so this is purchasing power parity. Now we have the second theory of called international Fisher effect. We've already talked about Fisher effect before. A Fisher effect suggests that the nominal interest rate contains two components. Nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate plus expected inflation rate. Okay, we've learned this in our Principle of Finance 305 class, right? R nominal equals R star, the real interest rate, plus IP, inflation premium. Okay, so nominal interest rate is real interest rate plus inflation rate or inflation premium. The real rate of interest represents the return on the investment to savers after accounting for expected inflation. Okay, so if we remove inflation from the nominal, we would have the real interest rate. Okay, that's Fisher effect in general. Using international Fisher effect to predict exchange rate movements, apply the Fisher effect to derive expected inflation per country. The first step is to derive the expected inflation rates of the two countries based on the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect suggests that nominal interest rates of two countries differ because of the difference in expected inflation between the two countries. Rely on PPP to estimate the exchange rate movement. The second step of the international Fisher effect is to apply the theory of PPP to determine how the exchange rate would change in response to those expected inflation of the two countries. Okay, so there are two steps of international Fisher effect. Step 1, Fisher effect. Okay, the nominal interest rates could be different because of the could be different between two countries because of the two different inflation rates. Step 2, apply PPP. Okay, exchange rate could change because of the expected inflation rate could change. And the expected inflation rate exchange rate could change because the expected inflation rate could change. Implications of the international Fisher effect. IFE theory suggests that currencies with high interest rates will have high expected inflation due to the Fisher effect, and the relatively high inflation will cause the currency to depreciate due to the PPP effect. Okay, so we have two steps here. The country with high inflation, the country with high interest rate will have high inflation because of Fisher effect. And then the relatively high inflation would cause the currency to depreciate due to PPP effect. Okay, because we have two steps here. Okay, we have different interest rate because we have different inflation. And because we have different inflation, we would have different exchange rate. Implication rate of IFE for foreign investors. The implications are similar for foreign investors who attempt to capitalize on relatively high US interest rates. The foreign investors will be adversely affected by the effects of a relatively high US inflation rate if they try to capitalize on the high US interest rates. Okay, so for foreign investors, if they want to capitalize on the high US interest rates, they have to pay attention that there's also a high inflation, US inflation as well, due to the Fisher effect. And due to the high inflation, the foreign currency might depreciate. Okay. And foreign investors might be adversely affected. Implications of the IFE for two non-US currencies. The IFE theory can be applied to any exchange rate, even exchange rates that involve two non-US currencies. Illustration of the IFE for various investor perspectives. Now we have investors in Japan, US, and Canada attempt to invest in three countries. Expected inflation differential, home inflation minus foreign inflation rate for US. For investors in Japan trying to invest in US, home inflation rate is 3% for Japan, minus the US inflation rate 6%, so the difference is negative 3%. And for investors residing in Japan trying to invest in Canada, the difference in inflation rate is negative 8%. Okay, and for United States, the difference is 3 and negative 5% if they want to invest in Japan or Canada. And for Canadian investors, if they want to invest in Japan or US, their inflation difference is 8% and 5%. Okay, and then we have this column, which is the expected percentage change in currency needed by investors, which is the same as the difference in inflation rate. Nominal interest rate to be earned. Okay, it's listed here. And then we have return to investors after considering exchange rate adjustment. Okay, so if we have nominal interest rate of 5 in Japan, 8 in US, and 13 in Canada, then we need to make changes to this interest rate based on the expected percentage change in currency to do the exchange rate adjustment. Okay, so for Japan investors, no matter which country they invest in, even though the interest rate is higher if they invest in US or Canada, but because of the higher inflation rate in US and Canada as well, we'll have to we'll have a currency depreciation. Okay, so the interest rate, higher interest rate minus the change in the currency, okay, gives us the same final return for the 3 cases. Inflation anticipated in home country, again, is 3% for Japan. The real return earned by investors would be the final return minus the inflation. So the real interest rate would be 2% for the 3 cases. Okay, same for US investors. They could have higher nominal interest rate if they invest in US or Canada, but because of the inflation difference and the exchange rate adjustment, they're actually making the same return in the 3 cases. And after we adjust for the inflation, domestic inflation, we have 2% return, real return. For Canada, same case, we have also 2% real return. Derivation of IFE. So relationship between the interest rate differential between the 2 countries and expected exchange rate would be EF equals 1 plus interest rate of the home country divided by 1 plus interest rate of the foreign country minus 1. Simplified relationship would be EF equals IH minus IF. Okay, so this looks very similar to the purchasing power parity. It's just in the purchasing power parity, the expected exchange rate equals to inflation rate of home country minus inflation rate of foreign country. Here, we change the inflation rate to the interest rate. Okay. Because we know according to Fisher effect, okay, according to Fisher effect, we know interest rate will be affected by inflation rate because interest rate is just that, the real rate plus inflation rate. Okay, and then because of purchasing power parity, we know that exchange rate could be affected by inflation. Okay, so it could also be affected by interest rate. Summary of IFE. When we have relatively high local interest rate in scenario 1, we have a relatively high expected local inflation as well. Okay, so and then we have more imports and less exports, so local currency should depreciate by level of inflation differential. So you could see the second, third, and fourth steps here are the same as PPP. Okay, we're just using Fisher effect as our first step here. We know when there's a change in interest rate, there should be a change in inflation. Okay, and then the difference in inflation would cause the change in foreign exchange rate. And same applies to other cases. So again, international Fisher effect is just combining purchasing power parity with the Fisher effect. Okay, so that's why we're using interest rate instead of inflation rate in our formula and in our graph here. And then for the IFE line, when exchange rate chart changes perfectly offset interest rate differential, we also have the same line y equals x as our international Fisher effect line. Any point on the line satisfies the equation, and any point of the line does not satisfy the equation. Point E here is on the line, and it shows us that's -3 for both x and y, meaning a situation where the foreign interest rate exceeds the home interest rate by 3%. The foreign currency has depreciated by 3% to offset its interest rate advantage. Okay. Point F is also on the line, +2. So it represents a home interest rate 2% above the foreign interest rate. And that currency should appreciate by 2% to offset the interest rate disadvantage. Point F illustrates the IFE from a foreign investor's perspective. The home interest rate will appear attractive to the foreign investors. However, IFE theory suggests that the foreign currency will appreciate by 2% to offset the advantage. Points on the IFE line. All the points along the line reflect exchange rate adjustments to offset the difference in interest rates. This means investors will end up achieving the same yield adjusted for exchange rate fluctuations, whether they invest at home or in a foreign country. Points below the IFE line generally reflect the higher returns from investing in foreign deposits. Points above the line generally reflect returns from foreign deposits that are lower than the returns possibly domestically. So points on the line, it doesn't make a difference whether you invest at home or in a foreign country. Points below the line, higher return for investing in foreign country. Points above the line, higher return investing domestically. Tests of the IFE. What can be tested? If the actual point, one for each period of interest rates, and the exchange rate changes were plotted over time on the graph, we could determine whether the points are systematically below the IFE line, suggesting higher returns from foreign investing, or above the line, suggesting lower returns from foreign investing, or evenly scattered on both sides, suggesting a balance of high returns from foreign investing in some periods and lower foreign returns in some other periods. Statistical tests apply regression analysis to the historical exchange rates and the nominal inflation interest rate difference. Okay, so if here we can see is a test of IFE effects, and we can see there's evenly points above and below the line. Okay, so sometimes, so we have a balance of high returns from foreign investing in some periods and lower returns in other periods. Limitations of IFE. IFE theory relies on both Fisher effects and purchasing power parity. The difference between the nominal interest rate and actual inflation rate is not consistent. Thus, while the Fisher effect can effectively use nominal interest rate to estimate the market's expected inflation over a particular period, the market may be wrong Okay, so we have limitation of Fisher effect. That gives us limitation on IFE. We also have limitation on PPP, so that gives us limitation on IFE as well. Other country characteristics besides inflation, income level, government control, expectation, and also interest rate difference can affect exchange rate movements, even if the expected inflation derived from the Fisher effect probably reflects the actual inflation rate over the period. Relying solely on inflation to forecast the future exchange rate is subject to error. So we've discussed this in the first part of our chapter, that PPP has its limitations. IFE theory versus reality. The IFE theory contradicts how a country with a high interest rate can attract more capital flows and therefore cause the local currency's value to strengthen. Which we talked about in chapter 4. Okay, here we're saying that because of the foreign exchange rate change, this effect is offset. IFE theory also contradicts how central banks may purposely try to raise interest rates in order to attract funds and strengthen the value of their local currencies, which we discussed in chapter 6. Whether the IFE holds in reality is dependent on the countries involved and the period assessed. The IFE theory may be especially meaningful to situations in which the multinational corporations and large investors consider investing in countries where the prevailing interest rates are very high. Okay, so IFE theory is not what is actually happening in reality sometimes. Comparison of these three theories, IRP, interest rate parity, and two theories we learned today, purchasing power parity and international Fisher effect. Although all these three theories relate to the determination of interest rates, they have different implications. IRP, interest rate parity, we learned in chapter 7, focuses on why the forward rate differs from the spot rate and on the degree of difference that should exist. It relates to a specific point of time. Purchasing power parity and international Fisher effect focus on how a currency's spot rate will change over time. Whereas purchasing power parity suggests that the spot rate will change in accordance with inflation differentials. IFE suggests that it will change in accordance with interest rate differentials. Purchasing power parity is related to international Fisher effect because expected inflation differentials influence the nominal interest rate differentials between the two countries. Okay, so PPP and IFE, they're interrelated, and they're about how inflation or interest rate differentials affect spot rate change. And for IRP, it's about the forward premium at a specific point of time. Okay, so again, for IRP, we're talking about forward discount or premium. For Fisher effects, it's about inflation. It's about interest rate difference and inflation rate difference. They can be interconnected because according to Fisher effect, inflation is just inflation plus real interest rate is the nominal interest rate. Okay, and then for international Fisher effect, we're saying that interest rate difference can affect exchange rate difference. And for purchasing power parity, we're saying that inflation rate difference can affect exchange rate expectations. Okay. And for interest rate parity, we're saying that interest rate difference can affect forward premium. Okay, so this is putting the definition of these theories together. Okay, so again, this graph shows us the summary of the theory. Interest rate parity, is telling us how interest rate difference can affect forward premium or discount. The forward rate of one currency with respect to another will contain a premium that is determined by the difference in interest rate between the two countries. As a result, covered interest arbitrage will provide a return that's no higher than a domestic return. Purchasing power parity is telling us that the inflation rate difference can affect the percentage change in spot rate exchange rate. The spot rate of one currency with respect to another will change in reaction to the differential in inflation rates between the two countries. Consequently, the purchasing power for consumers when purchasing goods in their own country will be similar to their purchasing power when importing goods from the foreign country. International feature effect is telling us how interest rate differential can affect our exchange rate, percentage change in spot exchange rate. Okay, the spot rate of one currency with respect to another will change in accordance to the differential in interest rate between the two countries. Consequently, the return on uncovered foreign money market securities will, on average, be no higher than the return on domestic money market securities from the perspective of investors in the home country. Okay, so this is comparing the definition of these three theories. Summary. Purchasing power parity, PPP, theory specifies a precise relationship between relative inflation rates of the two countries and their exchange rate. In exact terms, PPP theory suggests that the equilibrium exchange rate will adjust by the same magnitude as the differential in inflation rates between two countries. Though PPP continues to be a valuable concept, there is evidence of sizable deviations from the theory in the real world. The International Fisher Effect, IFE, specifies a precise relationship between relative interest rates of two countries and their exchange rates. It suggests that an investor who periodically invests in foreign interest-bearing securities will, on average, achieve a return similar to what's possible domestically. This implies that the exchange rate of the country with high interest rates will depreciate to offset the interest rate advantage achieved by foreign investments. However, there is evidence that during some periods the IFE does not hold. Thus, investment in foreign short-term securities may achieve a higher return than what is possible domestically. The purchasing power parity theory focuses on the relationship between inflation rate differential and foreign and future exchange rate movements. The International Fisher Effect focuses on the interest rate differential and future exchange rate movements. The theory of interest rate parity, IRP, focuses on the relationship between the interest rate differential and the forward premium at a given point of time. Practice. If interest rate parity holds, then the one-year forward rate of a currency will be the predicted spot rate of the currency in 1 year, according to the International Fisher Effect. A greater than, B less than, C equal to. The answer is dependent on whether the forward rate has a discount or premium. Okay, please take some time, review all the concepts, and think about this question. Okay, so this question is a little bit tricky. If you need more time, you can keep pausing the video, take out a pen and paper and try to write down what is interest rate parity, what is International Fisher Effect, and how do we connect these to 1-year forward rate and 1-year spot rate. Okay, and to see what's the relation between these two rates. If you're ready to look at the answer, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so for this question, let's first write out interest rate parity. Okay, it is saying that the forward premium P equals the difference between forward rate and spot rate, F minus S, divided by S. Okay, and this should be equal to the home interest rate IH minus IF. Okay, this is the interest rate parity we learned in the last chapter. And according to International Fisher effect, we know that the change in exchange rate, EF, equals also home interest rate minus foreign interest rate, right? EF equals IH minus IF is what we learned from International Fisher effect. Okay, so here we already have 1-year forward rate in our equation, but here we're asking how 1-year forward rate is related to predict the spot rate of the currency in 1 year. Okay, so we have forward rate now, okay, for the forward that's gonna be carried out after a year. And we know the current spot rate. We also have a change in spot rate here, EF. Change in the exchange rate here. Okay, which is also the change in the spot rate. Okay, so EF equals S1, the spot rate after year, minus S, the current spot rate, divided by S, the current spot rate. Okay, so we have this line equation here. So F, the forward rate, equals the S1. The 1-year forward rate equals predicted spot rate in a year, S1. Because forward premium equals spot rate change in 1 year. Okay, so that's all for chapter 8. Okay, again, I'm not gonna give out homework questions for this chapter, and I will, it's very likely that for the final exam, we will only cover chapter 5, 6, and 7, 3 chapters as well. So I'm still gonna discuss about chapter 8 and 9 in this video and also in the future video, but chapters 8 and 9 will not be the focus for our class. Okay, and moreover, I think a lot of you may have already seen the email from the provost that due to the coronavirus outbreak, students can start to apply for certain classes that they can apply to request to receive only a passing or failing grade for the class instead of receiving A, B, C, D, F. You can receive passing if you get any grade from A to D, and you will receive an F if you get a grade of F. Okay, so I think our class should be included. So if you would like to request that, you can follow the email and request the grade category change. Okay, and I hope everyone passed the course. All right, so that's all. I'll talk to you more in the next video.